It is January 1150. You are standing in a field in rural England and the ground is frozen so hard it rings when you step on it. The sun set at 3:30. The wind is coming from the east, which means it has been picking up speed across flat, open country for the better part of 100 miles before it reaches you, and it reaches you with enthusiasm. You are a peasant. You own nothing. Not even yourself, that belongs to the Lord whose land you work, whose court decides your disputes, and whose share of the harvest was taken before you counted yours. The temperature will not rise above freezing for weeks. Spring is 3 months away. And you are not panicking. That is the part that should bother you. Not the cold. Not the poverty. Not the fact that the Lord takes his cut before you eat. The part that should bother you is that the peasant standing in this field in 1150 knows exactly what to do right now, and you, with your central heating, your supermarket, your thermostat set to 21 degrees, do not. Not even close. 7 things stand between this person and death. Some of them you will recognize. Some of them will surprise you. One of them will not look like a tool at all. And every single one of them is something you have forgotten how to use. Number 1. The anticipatory calendar. You think winter is something that happens to you. It is not. It is something you prepare for, beginning in the summer, with a level of deliberate, systematic, calendar-driven precision that would make a modern project manager feel personally attacked. The medieval peasant did not experience winter as an emergency. They experienced it as a managed season, and the management began months before the first frost. The hinge date was November the 11th. Martinmas. This was the day the medieval food year turned. You slaughtered the animals you could not afford to feed through winter, because winter fodder was limited, and an animal that ate more than it was worth in stored hay was not a pet, it was a liability with a pulse. The decision about which animals lived and which died was not sentimental. It was mathematical. You counted your hay. You counted your animals. You subtracted. The remainder got the knife. But Martinmas was not just a slaughter day. It was the deadline for an entire preparation system that had been running since August. The grain was already in. The root vegetables were already cellared. The firewood had been coppiced, cut, split and stacked months ago, because wetwood does not burn, and wood cut in November is wetwood, and wetwood in January is not an inconvenience, it is a death sentence you wrote yourself by being lazy in July. The modern version of this is a supply chain you do not control, a supermarket you did not stock, and a heating system you cannot fix. The medieval peasant's calendar was a survival plan executed over 6 months. Yours is an assumption that the infrastructure will hold. The peasant was right to plan. You are gambling. The difference is that the peasant knew it. Fire, walls, food, clothing, none of them work without this. The calendar is not the first tool because it is the most dramatic. It is the first tool because without it, none of the others exist when you need them. Which raises the question, once you have planned for winter, what exactly are you eating? That brings us to number 2. Number 2. Cold season food. The harvest ends in October. Spring begins in April. That gap, 6 months of cold, dark, short days and hard frost, is not an inconvenience. It is the entire problem. And the medieval peasants solved it with a food preservation system so layered, so deliberate, and so effective that calling it primitive is an admission that you do not understand what you are looking at. The Martinmas slaughter produced meat that had to last months. Salting was not flavoring, it was chemistry. Salt draws moisture out of flesh through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria cannot survive. A peasant in 1150 did not know the word osmosis. They knew the result, which is what the word is for. Smoking did 3 things simultaneously. It dried the surface, deposited antimicrobial compounds from the wood smoke, and created a physical barrier against moisture and insects. 3 preservation mechanisms in a single process that smelled like breakfast and functioned like a laboratory. Fermentation, sauerkraut, brined vegetables, cured pork, was not desperation. It was a planned, managed chemical transformation that converted perishable food into stable food with a longer shelf life and, in the case of fermented vegetables, improved nutritional availability. The bacteria doing the work were not understood. The results were understood completely. Root cellaring exploited the thermal stability of the earth below frost line, A root cellar stays at roughly 4 degrees Celsius year-round, which is exactly the temperature range that slows bacterial growth without freezing the food. You are looking at a medieval peasant who built a fridge using the ground. And then there was pottage, the daily staple. A thick, slow-cooked stew of grains, root vegetables, whatever herbs were available, and whatever preserved meat could be spared. It was not poverty food. It was high-calorie, high-carbohydrate fuel engineered for sustained cold-weather labor. It sat on the fire all day. You ate it when you could. It kept you working. The modern equivalent is a ready meal that took 30 seconds in a microwave and contains less nutritional planning than a bowl of food designed by someone who could not read. A family that entered winter without sufficient preserved food did not run out dramatically. They ran out slowly, meal by meal, until the portions were too small to sustain work, and the work stopped, and everything that depended on the work stopped with it. You have the food. But food without warmth is just fuel with nowhere to burn. Which brings us to number 3. Number 3. The dwelling as thermal engine. A house in January is not where you live. It is the difference between surviving until morning and not. And the medieval peasant's house, the one that looks wrong to every modern eye that sees it, was one of the most thermally intelligent structures available to anyone without a cathedral budget. The ceilings were low. Not because they could not build higher, but because a room with a 7-foot ceiling retains heat in the occupied zone significantly more efficiently than a room with a 12-foot ceiling. Hot air rises. A low ceiling stops it from rising somewhere useless. This was not a limitation of skill. It was a decision. The thatch roof had an insulation value comparable to modern insulated roofing. Not a primitive substitute. A high-performance material that was locally sourced, annually renewable, and reparable by the people who lived under it without calling anyone. The animals were inside. Cattle at one end of the longhouse, family at the other. This was not poverty. A single cow produces roughly 500 to 1,000 BTU of heat per hour, the equivalent of a small radiator that requires no fuel, no maintenance, and no electricity. It eats hay and produces heat. The medieval peasant looked at a cow and saw a heating system that also made milk. You look at a cow in a bedroom and see squalor. One of you is wrong, and it is not the one who is warm. The central hearth had no chimney. The smoke filled the upper room, coated the thatch, preserved it against rot, deterred insects, and cured any meat hanging from the rafters. The smoke was not a design flaw. It was doing 4 jobs at once. Communal sleeping, multiple bodies in one room, often in one bed, was not an indignity. Each human body generates approximately 80 watts of heat at rest. 6 people in a room is 6 free heaters. The mathematics of body heat made it rational. The modern arrangement, 1 person per room, each room individually heated by a system that depends on gas, electricity, and an unbroken supply chain, is more comfortable. It is also more fragile by every measurable standard. A poorly built house in January does not fail dramatically. It just gets colder and colder. And one morning the coldest person in it does not wake up. You have walls and warmth. But a warm body in wet clothing is a body losing heat faster than it can make it. Which brings us to number 4. Number 4. Wool and layering. A body that cannot stay warm cannot work. A body that cannot work cannot eat. The clothing is not the least of these tools. It is the one you wear every hour of every day, and the medieval peasant wore it with a material logic that most modern people have entirely abandoned. Wool retains approximately 80% of its insulating value when wet. Read that again. 80%. Almost no other natural fiber does this. Cotton, the fabric you are most likely wearing right now, loses nearly all of its insulation when damp. In a January rain, in a field, doing physical labor that generates sweat, the medieval peasant was wearing the right material and you are wearing the wrong one. This was not fashion. This was thermal engineering tested against actual winters and actual deaths. Linen undergarments went against the skin, not as effective as modern synthetic base layers, but meaningfully better than nothing. The layering logic was specific: linen against skin to wick moisture, wool above to trap heat. Outer layers were adjusted throughout the day by activity level. Heavy work generated body heat that required ventilation. Rest required maximum insulation. A medieval peasant adjusted their layers the way you adjust a thermostat, except theirs worked without electricity. The fringe on medieval garments, which looks purely decorative to a modern eye, wicked rainwater away from the main fabric, preventing saturation. Every element of the clothing had a function. There was no decoration that was only decoration. Foot wrapping and leather boots packed with straw or wool were not improvised. They were standard cold management practice. The straw was not stuffing. It was insulation, dead air trapped between fibers, the same principle behind every modern insulated boot, arrived at by people who did not have the vocabulary for thermal conductivity but understood the result perfectly. Patching and repair were constant. A garment that failed in January was not replaced, it was fixed immediately because the alternative was not discomfort. It was exposure. And hypothermia does not feel like cold. It feels like warmth and sleepiness, and the entirely false conviction that lying down for a moment would be fine. The last thing hypothermia takes from you is the knowledge that it is taking anything at all. You are warm, fed, sheltered, and dressed. But you are also assuming the body inside the clothing is the same as yours. It is not. Which brings us to number 5. Number 5. The cold-adapted body. You live in a world that is 21 degrees Celsius, year-round, indoors. Your body has been trained by that world. It has not been trained by cold. The medieval peasant's body had. And the difference is not trivial. Cold acclimatization is a documented physiological process. Regular exposure to cold temperatures over weeks and months produces measurable changes. Peripheral blood vessels learn to constrict more efficiently, reducing heat loss through the skin. Brown fat, metabolically active fat tissue that generates heat, increases in volume. Shivering threshold drops. The body learns, over time and repeated exposure, to generate and retain heat more effectively. The medieval peasant had this. You do not. You have not been cold enough, often enough, for long enough, for your body to bother adapting. Seasonal fattening was not gluttony, it was fuel storage. A body entering winter with a higher fat percentage has a larger energy reserve and better insulation. The autumn diet was deliberately calorie-dense. The late summer and autumn festivals, harvest feasts, Michaelmas, the weeks before Advent fasting began, were not just celebrations. They were the last opportunity to lay down the fat reserves that would carry a body through months of cold and reduced food. Winter sleep patterns were longer. Significantly longer. Historical records and later anthropological studies suggest that pre-industrial European populations slept up to 14 hours in deep winter, not in a single block, but in 2 phases, with a period of wakefulness in between. This was not laziness. It was metabolic conservation. A sleeping body burns fewer calories. A body that sleeps more in winter needs less food in winter. The extended sleep was the body's own rationing system. Medieval medicine operated on humoral theory, the idea that the body was governed by 4 humors that shifted with the seasons. The theory was wrong. But the practical prescriptions that followed from it, warming foods in winter, reduced activity in cold, specific herbal preparations for cold weather ailments, often produced outcomes that worked, arrived at by observation over centuries even though the explanation was incorrect. They had the right answers built on the wrong reasons. We have the right reasons and rarely bother with the answers. Your body has never been asked to manage cold. It has been managed for you by a thermostat since the day you were born. The medieval peasant's body was a participant in its own warmth. Yours is a passenger. You are warm, fed, dressed, sheltered, and biologically prepared. You are also, so far, doing all of this alone. Which is the problem? Which brings us to number 6. Number 6. Communal warmth. You have the fire. You have the walls. You have the food, the clothing, the adapted body. And if you are alone with all of it, you are still in trouble. Not because any single tool fails, but because the labor of maintaining all of them simultaneously, every day, through the darkest months, is more than one family can sustain without the village around it. Communal sleeping on the coldest nights was not poverty. It was thermal strategy. Multiple families sharing a single structure, the largest, the best insulated, the one with the most animal heat at one end, was the rational response to temperatures that dropped below the survivable range for a single household. The mathematics of body heat made it obvious. A building with 20 people in it is warmer than a building with 4. Shared labor in cold was not charity. It was infrastructure. The work of winter, breaking ice at the well, hauling water before it refroze, maintaining fires, repairing shelters, feeding and managing livestock, was distributed across the village because it had to be. A single family trying to do all of it would exhaust itself. The village divided the load the way a modern city divides services across departments, except the village did it with no budget, no bureaucracy, and the understanding that if one household failed, the failure would spread. The communal plow team required multiple oxen owned collectively by several families. No single family could afford a full team. The open field system, strips of land distributed across the village's fields, meant that every family's harvest depended on every other family's labor. This was not collectivism as ideology. It was collectivism as physics. The plow was too heavy for one household to pull. Mutual aid was not generosity. It was insurance. A family that helped a neighbor through a bad week was a family that could expect help when their own bad week came. The informal networks of obligation, reciprocity, and shared knowledge that ran through a medieval village were the social technology that made individual survival possible. Break the network and you did not just lose company. You lost the blacksmith for your blade, the collective oxen for your field, the neighbor who knew which herbs brought down a fever, the extra bodies that kept the building warm on the nights when the temperature tried to kill you. A family that withdrew from the village, through conflict, through pride, through circumstances they could not control, lost everything on this list simultaneously. Not because the tools stopped existing. Because the labor of using them all alone was beyond what any single household could sustain. The village was not a community in the modern sense. A nice thing to have, an amenity, a lifestyle preference. It was the operating system. Remove it and the hardware still exists. It just does not run. You have 6 tools and 40 neighbors who know how to use them. But there is one more thing on this list. And it is the one that should keep you up at night. Which brings us to number 7. Number 7. The knowledge itself. This is the last tool. It is the most important one. And it is the one you have already lost. Everything on this list, the anticipatory calendar, the preserved food, the thermal dwelling, the wool layering, the cold-adapted body, the communal warmth, was knowledge. Not written knowledge. Inherited knowledge. Taught by doing, learned by watching, tested against real winters, refined by actual deaths over generations. A grandmother who knew when to slaughter and a grandfather who knew how to read the wind and a neighbor who knew which well was safe after thaw and a village that held, collectively, a complete manual for surviving cold that no single individual could hold alone. None of it was written down. All of it was carried in people. You replaced it. Every pillar. The seasonal food calendar became a year-round supermarket supplied by a global chain you do not control. The thermal dwelling became central heating powered by gas or electricity you cannot produce. The wool layering became cotton and synthetic fabrics chosen for fashion, not function. The cold-adapted body became a climate-controlled interior that your physiology never had to argue with. The communal village became individual households, each one independently dependent on the same fragile infrastructure. You are warmer than the medieval peasant. You are more comfortable. You live longer. And if the power goes out for 72 hours in January, you do not know how to start a fire, which of your clothes will keep you warm when wet, how to keep food from spoiling without a fridge, or which of your neighbors you could trust to share a room with for warmth. The medieval peasant knew all of it. Not because they were smarter. Because they had to. 7 tools. The calendar, the food, the dwelling, the wool, the body, the village, and the knowledge that made all 6 of them work. The medieval peasant did not survive winter because they were tough. They survived because they knew things, specific, practical, tested things, and they held that knowledge collectively in a community that could not afford to forget any of it. You forgot all of it. You did it on purpose. You called it progress. And on the coldest night of the year, in a house that needs electricity to be warm, you are the one who should be worried. Not them. They knew exactly what they were doing. The question is whether you do.